Hello and good morning, everyone, from New York City to all of our viewers. My name is Sarah Jane Demy, and I am the founder and CEO of Demy-Colton. And on behalf of the Demy-Colton team, along with our partner for this salon, Biotech Digital Partnering, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 49th installment of the Demy-Colton Virtual Salon Series. And as usual, we welcome all of our past participants back and welcome all of you who are new to the Demy-Colton Virtual Salon Series. As many of you may know, Demy-Colton's mission is to convene healthcare industry leaders to catalyze change. We do this through our in-person events, including BioFuture, Biotech Showcase, which just recently concluded in San Francisco, our virtual salon, such as this one today, as well as our first Global Biotech CEO Summit, which is the unification of our European and US CEO Summits. It will take place in Napa this July. And if any of you are interested in joining us, please reach out to us and request an invitation. So in fact, today's salon will give you a preview of the type of conversations you might expect to find in our CEO Summit. Before we start today's salon, I'd like to introduce Patrick Fry. Patrick is the founder and CEO of Venture Valuation, as well as Biotech Digital Partnering. He's located in Zurich, Switzerland, and he'd like to say a few words. Patrick.
Yes, thank you very much, Sarah, for the introduction. And it's always a pleasure to work with you and your team. This is part of, as you mentioned, Biotech Digital Partnering. So it's actually a whole week of partnering that we organize every quarter. And we have also participants from all over the world. The goal is really bringing people virtually together, beside the physical meetings that you organize, and I'm always happy to participate and be part of that. We have the virtual part. If any of the viewers are interested, digitalpartnering.com, you can go there and register. So it's still gonna go on until Friday. And we're always happy to have great speakers. And so that's why we are very happy to work with Sarah and her team. And I'm very much looking forward to the next hour and get some insight into what's happening or might happen next this year. So thanks very much.
Yeah, so thank you. Thank you so much, Patrick. Today's salon is titled A Conversation with Tim Opler and Navigating the Biotech Financial Markets in 2025, and maybe teeing it up for 2026. Now, before we begin, I'd like to mention that this will go on for 50 to 55 minutes. It will be followed by a Q&A session. And as well, this salon is being recorded, and it will be available for on-demand viewing later on today on the Demy-Colton YouTube channel. So with that said, let me bring on Tim. Tim is currently the managing director of Stifel's Global Healthcare Group, leading strategic and financing transactions across multiple healthcare sectors. Tim co-founded Torreya Partners. I don't know, what year was that, Tim? A while ago.
A long time ago, 2007.
2007, which was acquired by Stifel in 2023. For any of you who know Tim and have seen Tim or met with Tim at various meetings, he does transactions around the world, Asia, Europe, the US, and he's someone that we really enjoy interacting with because of his wisdom. Tim, I set you up with the word wisdom. So, Tim, the very first question I'd like to ask you is to take a look at your crystal ball. What do you see happening for the biotech healthcare sector this year in 2025? And we can get into more of the details about some of the challenges that are currently facing this sector. But on a high level,
Look,
what do you see?
biotech sector is a great success story. It is really one of the world's success stories, and 2025 is going to be no exception. So I expect to see more great companies progress this year, more drugs get to patients through approvals by various regulatory agencies, and most importantly, the pace of innovation in research continue to rise. It is important to note that as we speak, we are in a period of a bit of a downturn in the sector, and that downturn is very much linked to some of the dynamics that took place both in the market. There's a stock market for these biotechs after the pandemic, but also I think there have been some external factors, particularly the macroeconomic environment. So I do see the macroeconomic environment, particularly the course of interest rates in the United States, improving. And I do see 2025 as a year where some of the key themes of the market will play out in a manner that will be very positive, both for patients, but also investors in the sector.
Yeah, Tim, that's a really upbeat prediction for 2025, considering, if you will, the kind of the chaos that has greeted us this year. How does that sync with your prediction?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to take a long run perspective. So I'm personally very interested in the history of medicine going back many centuries. And so, it's fair to say that the course of innovation that we're experiencing today, is part of a process that really kicked off a long time ago, the so-called scientific enlightenment in the late uh, 16th century, early 17th century. And the dynamics underlying that are sort of, in my opinion, more or less unstoppable, right? We would need to sort of talk about, major changes to our species to start to do that. So yes, the United States is going through a bit of a episode at the moment. We have a president who is probably a little bit less science oriented than some of his predecessors, and some of the appointees to various positions, such as RFK Jr., are, not necessarily the world's most scientifically oriented, most progressive people that we've seen. But I guess my own perspective is this too shall pass. Um, the underlying dynamics driving investment returns in our industry will not change in any significant way, in my opinion.
That's good to hear. I know that Bio's CEO is in consultation apparently with RFK. And as well, I know that the association AdvaMed has also struck up a conversation with them to make sure some of the changes that are taking place right now that we're seeing can either be mitigated, if you will, such as cutting off of NIH funding. So hopefully they will have an impact, in the short term for us. So in terms of innovation, what regions in the world do you see having the most innovation? And I'm thinking US, North America, China, Asia, and Europe.
Yeah, look, I mean, the underlying basic science innovation is very much tied to the types of funding you referenced from groups like NIH. And so some countries obviously have more funding available. If you're in, I don't know, Central Africa, there's probably a lot less funding for scientific endeavors than there might be in Europe, China, or the United States. But in general, my own perspective is that innovation can come from anywhere, which is one of the reasons, as you mentioned, I kind of have a global approach to my own practice at Stifel. And it's very exciting to see, interesting companies today in Brazil, interesting companies today in Japan. India is a place that, like, if you'd asked folks 20 years ago, like, is there going to be interesting innovation in India? People would say, no, not really. Um, well, guess what? There's a lot of really good innovation in India right now. So, the ability to innovate is globalizing. And one of the things, again, as someone who's interested in the history of medicine, that I would point to is, you know, any school kid can sit at a computer today, go to Google or Chat GPT or some other resource, and essentially explore kind of whatever you want to know about science, right? So you just go to PubMed, type in some obscure topic, fibroblasts, replication, tendencies, and everything you want to know just pops up. And so we're seeing a democratization of innovation take place today.
I think that that will make the world a better place, actually, when you
It's great.
consider
It's
where it's
great.
all coming from.
Yeah, no, it's great news for patients. It's great news for our species. Um,
Hmm.
there's always dynamics. So at the moment, there's kind of this realization that maybe the primacy of the United States in the biotech sector is under some challenge. And so we're seeing companies in China that are able to develop molecules at a lower cost, at a faster speed, and molecules that are really good molecules. And so all of a sudden, if you're US biotech sitting in San Francisco, you might be like a little bit less secure today than you could have been 5 years ago. I
Hmm.
don't see that type of competition as a bad thing. Ultimately, competition and innovation is a good thing, right? Because we want good outcomes for patients, and as I said, they can come from anywhere.
Right, yeah, that's absolutely correct. We do want good outcomes. And this year, just reflecting on your statement at Biotech Showcase, we saw a really large delegation coming in from Singapore. We saw a really large delegation from China as well. The past few years, we haven't seen that type of participation in Biotech Showcase. And we understand that, right now in China, a lot of funding for Chinese companies has dried up a little bit, and they're very eager since their later stage to do deals with US companies, find licensing agreements with US companies or pharma companies. So that was pretty exciting to see at Biotech Showcase. And at our CEO summit last year, we had a Singaporean CEO at our European event, and as well, we had a Japanese CEO join us for our US event, and we expect more this year, which is great. That blending, because as you said, Tim, innovation doesn't really recognize boundaries, if you will.
Right. Science is
Yeah.
science.
Yeah. It's probably most limited by the availability of funding. So
No, for
let's.
sure. And look, funding ecosystems matter a lot, and
Mhm.
different countries are in very different places in terms of the maturity of their ecosystem. And I mean, just to make kind of an obvious comment, biosciences are complex. Again, coming back to, like the plasticity of a fibroblast. Like, yeah, I don't know if you need a PhD, but really sitting down with ChatGPT for 5 minutes is not going to give you the expertise you need. And so what you see is some countries just have more access to investors that have the requisite scientific backgrounds to be able to process all of these ideas. And that's a key limitation in the ability of our financial sector to grow and be successful.
So moving on, Tim, then to the financial sector. Um, what's happening? Let's take a look at what's happening on the public side. Do you see companies teeing up to go public this year in the US or Europe or elsewhere? And then I'd like to move on to what you envision in the private sector and and especially in consideration of the fact that so much dry powder, so to say, is sitting on the sidelines. So let's focus on the public markets first.
Yeah, so I think it's important to start, with the barometer. So people talk about, financial markets, they'll typically refer to a financial index, the FTSE 100 or the S&P 500. Well, in biotech, we tend to talk about the XBI.
Mhm.
Interestingly, the XBI is just a measure of the value of a mutual fund that happens to own a broad cross section of biotech companies. And so, the XBI at the peak of the pandemic hit 171. At the depths of the post-pandemic reaction, negative reaction, went down to like 66. So as we sit here today, and really for the last year or so, the XBI has been bouncing around sort of between 90 and 100. I personally think that the XBI should end the year over 100, but I've been wrong so much. I'm so hesitant to pin down a forecast and then be shown to be wrong again. But what I can say is that we've seen significant exit from our market in the pandemic of generalists and retail investors in the United States, at least. And so one of the things that's happened is a lot of specialist funds have done really well. So think of, a group like Deep Track or RA Capital. These guys have managed to gather capital, and look, in any given year, some of them do well, some of them do poorly. But we've seen the US market become much more specialist dominated. So coming back to your question on IPOs, so what's going on? Well, this is actually last 6 weeks have been probably the strongest period we've had for IPOs in some time in biotech. In the United States, we've seen 4 significant IPOs go out. Last week saw Aardvark go out, and if you look at those 4 IPOs, at the moment, 2 of them are trading up, and 2 of them are trading down. And that's
How
sort of
unusual is
typical.
that, though, after companies go out? I mean, oftentimes you see them trade down after they're listed, right?
Oh yeah, right. But look, I mean, and I don't want to comment on any specific companies, but in general, stronger stories tend to trade up. They may get priced higher, but they also tend to trade up. And some of the weaker stories tend not to do as strong. And so some of the really interesting companies that have been going out that are more later stage, I think strong science, have been trading up. And then some of the companies that are, let's just say, a little earlier stage science, or maybe the story's not quite as compelling, are not trading as well. So what's happening today as we sit here in February 25 is actually quite typical of what's been happening. The other part of the public markets that one should comment on is the market for follow-on offerings. And look, we're in the middle of that stuff at Stifel. Stifel's one of the top 10 underwriters of these follow-on offerings. And what I can tell you is that the market for follow-on offerings right now is very selective. So it's a bit of a market of haves and have-nots, a tale of two cities, to paraphrase Dickens. And so you see companies that have higher market caps, sort of billion-dollar plus market caps, able to access the follow-on market at will. But say if you have a $150 million market cap, it's actually really tough to go raise money right now.
Yeah, I think we'll toward the end, we'll talk a little bit more about what you recommend companies do who are looking for capital that may not be able to go into the market. So, what do you think, Tim, will help unlock the dry powder, if you will, that's sitting on the sidelines with the retreat of generalists and everybody else from the market? What will unlock it?
It's a great question. So maybe to analogize, at the moment, companies in the tech sector have been doing very well. There's just tons of money flowing into tech, and that's driven in part by what's been happening in artificial intelligence, but also by other developments like the cloud. There are important, huge positive macro factors that are impacting the biosciences sector as well. Progress in drugs for cancer, progress in drugs for cardiometabolic disease, especially obesity, progress for the ability to target autoimmune diseases or diseases of autoinflammation. So the fundamentals are there, but the money has not been flowing in. And the key factors that are really inhibiting that story, that money, if you will, coming in are a couple. First and foremost has been the impact of interest rates. So we've been in a period of post-pandemic inflation. That's just not good for biotech. Higher long-term rates have inhibited people's ability to access capital. The second has been government policy. And, historically, the US government has been really the only one in the world that doesn't negotiate drug prices. And that
Mm.
really started to change with the Inflation Reduction Act during the Biden administration. So that's been a major confidence shaker of our industry. I think people are worried about it. My own view, as I already said, is like, you know, innovation wins. And we're seeing innovation now in spades in our sector. And, at the end of the day, people are going to be willing to pay for drugs that help them avoid disease, that help them live longer, better lives. And so I see these confidence sapping factors is going away. And I do see it in the long run generalists coming into our sector. How could you not, as a
Long run is
generalist?
Tim, when is long run? Is it going to end
It's
in 2
it's
months?
no, no, I couldn't tell you. If I told you that I knew like it's going to end in May 16th, like you should click off this Zoom call right away. Because I mean, no one really knows. But what I can tell you is that the underlying fundamentals are present.
So in terms of not being too predictive, do you think we will see in 2026 what we're experiencing now? Or do you think it's going to open up more in 2026? And
I'm
that's
going
but
to
on the public and the private side.
I'm going to be like a politician and answer a different question. So the question I want to ask and answer is like, what's it going to take for things to change?
Okay, let's go. Yeah.
I can't necessarily tell you when those things are going to happen. So look, what's going on right now is that the US Federal Reserve, which impacts long-term interest rates, which in turn impact the biotech sector, is very nervous, understandably, about policy actions in the Trump administration. Donald Trump has been overtly brandishing tariffs. This morning, I read more news stories. Now he wants to put tariffs on the pharmaceutical sector, which is a bit of a surprise to me. So, tariffs are in general inflationary. In addition to that, the U.S. is toying with policies to essentially, pick up immigrants that are illegally based in the United States and send them back to their home countries, usually with like military planes, which I mean, God knows how much money we're spending on all of that. I guess what I'm getting at is if I'm sitting at the Fed right now, I want to see what all of that does to inflation. And it doesn't help that we saw CPI inflation numbers for last
Yeah.
month, just last week, and the numbers wasn't good. And so what it's going to take for generalists to come back in or for biotech to really take off is Fed easing. And that's going to be very much a function, not so much of the underlying economic fundamentals, but of the perception of what's going on with the Trump administration. I'll make two positive comments, then maybe we can get back to 2026. One positive comment is tariffs send money to the US government. So let's just say hypothetically we decide to charge, $100 billion in tariffs on Thailand or something like that. Well, that $100 billion goes to pay down the deficit. If there's less of a deficit, there's less need, if you will, to conduct sort of core inflationary policies, right? We have to repay borrowed money with other money, or we can print money, that is raise inflation, debase the currency. And so tariffs reduce the pressure to debase the currency. So that's like kind of something no one's talking about, but is actually potentially positive. The other thing that I would note is it's very clear to me from Trump's behavior that he's more interested in the perception that the US be tough than the actual reality. In other words, I don't think Trump really wants to impose high tariffs, say on China, for example. What he would like to have is bargaining power in discussions over, policies between the two countries, and the imposition of tariffs is one way to get it. So I guess I'm sort of saying maybe the bark is a little worse than the bite in this situation, which will be fundamentally positive from a Fed perspective at some point.
Mm-hmm. What
So
about,
what about 2026? I do think these dynamics play out, right? And they play out in the next 6 months, not over the next 6 years. I mean, think of it this way. Trump has an end date. It's not the end of his presidency. It's the next election cycle, right? So the next election cycle takes place in 2026. So, in November 2026, US voters go to the polls. If inflation is high in November 2026, the Republicans have a problem. So they need to get inflation under control soon, which is why, again, I say all of this tariff stuff, illegal immigrant stuff, that's more political theater, in my opinion, than reality of policy actions.
okay, some perhaps light at the end of a tunnel?
I hope. I mean,
Perhaps.
well, I think we're all sort of watching with some morbid curiosity to see what happens.
Yeah, when we were at the Bio CEO and Investor Conference, I ran into one or two CEOs whose children are, either at Harvard or MD Anderson, who have been fired because their NIH grants were cut off. How will the cutting back of NIH funding, cutting back on spending with the CDC, cutting back on, spending with the VA, how will all of that affect the sector and ultimately, Tim, affect patients that are relying on that? So we've got two things going on: tamping down of, bright young innovators in one case, and patients that are waiting for solutions.
So let's start with the NIH. I think the narrative that one would pick up by reading, say, daily postings on the website for Science Magazine or the New York Times is sort of like, geez, the Trump administration is really negative on the NIH. They are specifically trying to change the overhead policy. So any NIH grant typically starts with the percentage of the money that's granted that goes to the investigator and the percentage that goes to the parent institution. So the NIH announced that they're going to have a 15% limit on overhead charges. To my knowledge, there haven't been mass firings at the NIH, right? So that's kind of a narrative that sort of crept out. There are firings going on at other agencies, but I'm not aware of firings at the
Well,
NIH.
the grantees, the people that are working under them. So at other
Correct.
institutions,
No,
the
yeah,
grantees have been terminated.
right.
So,
Right. So yes, I've seen those news stories too. I guess what I'm sort of questioning is sort of the veracity of all of that. And what I'm really
mhm.
driving at is, um, let's say you're at some research receiving institution, University of Oregon, and all of a sudden you're told that you only get a 15% overhead charge. Well, at the margin, you're going to be more careful about which grants you're going to let your investigators apply for and which investigators you want to keep. But this notion that somehow University of Oregon or other places are engaging in mass firings is simply not factual. I mean, I speak all the time to people at various universities.
That's
It's
good to hear. I mean, what I did, I saw a letter from a daughter sent to her mom, as one of the CEOs that presented at the meeting, letting her know that she was terminated because their funding had been cut off.
I'm not doubting that. I'm simply
Hmm.
saying that one should be very careful, especially in this day and age of social media. Any of us can get on X and sort of read all these scandalous stories and anecdotes. One should be very careful to extrapolate from
Well,
anecdotes to
yeah,
underlying policy changes. Um,
okay,
to come back to your broader
that's a good
question,
note.
though,
That's a good
yeah,
note, though.
to come back to your underlying question, the U.S. NIH has been progressively spending more money on supporting basic scientific research in healthcare quite steadily over the last 40 to 50 years. So the curve goes straight up. It's been growing at 3 to 6% a year in terms of that spending the entire time. I don't expect this spending to go up under the Trump administration. If anything, spending could go down. I think the effort to limit overhead charges is interesting. Maybe one that doesn't fully understand the context that these institutions are working in. And so, yeah, there's a bit of a earthquake that's hitting our sector, you might say. But my own perception is that basic science research is not in any fundamental way being threatened right now.
Okay, that's reassuring to hear, Tim. Thank
I
you
mean,
for that.
I hope I'm right. I mean, it would be really
We hope
unfortunate.
you're right too.
Yeah, it would be really unfortunate if the NIH budget was cut by 50% or something like that. But I don't think that's what's going on.
So, okay, so let's switch over to another topic of discussion, and I'll just put this out there to you. It's a question that came in, uh, uh, from one of our registrants who who asked if we expect or you expect to see the trend towards mega round Series A financings to continue, and or will there be a reversion to the typical 5 million or 50 million Series A's?
Yeah, I mean, I think the larger financings have been very much a reflection of the growing costs of conducting research. And so, $50 million financing just doesn't get you as far as it used to. I will say this, I was briefly a couple of years ago the CEO of a biotech company, not something that I volunteered for, it just sort of happened. I was on the board, they let go of the CEO, and there I was. And it's freaking expensive to run a biotech company. So accruing patients for an oncology study in the US is like $200,000 to $300,000 a patient. Call up your friendly recruiter saying, I'd like to hire a really good chief medical officer. And I'm thinking it's okay, is this 250K or is this 400,000? And he comes back like, oh, Fred wants 750,000 moved to your company. And so
Yeah.
it's just expensive. And so that's one of the factors. The other big factor underlying these mega rounds has been the change of the venture capital sector. And so specifically, we've seen three fund groups get really big. Bain Life Sciences has gotten really big. Arch has gotten really big. And Flagship's gotten really big. And so if you look at all of the money that's been accrued by, biotech VCs, those three funds account for a significant fraction of the money raised. And so by definition, Sarah, imagine you're running Flagship, say, you're not going to be doing 20 to $50 million rounds because you've got 3 or 4 billion that you need to allocate, right? And so that's part of what's going on. I didn't really answer the question, which is what's going to happen trend wise. I do think we are going to continue to see more of these large rounds. I'm not saying that the that the smaller round will go away. One really interesting factoid is if you look at Europe, it's very different than US. So Europe is not driven in general by mega rounds. So you see more mid-sized VCs doing sort of more typical rounds. The mega round phenomenon is largely a
Just the US?
US phenomenon.
Yeah. So when you take a look at Europe, how does the financing outlook currently look in Europe? And then if we flip over to Asia, let's talk about that, because I know that we do have people on this call that are in both those markets.
I sit in the US, so I'm not such an expert on those other markets, but in general, um, what we've seen are, I think, a fairly tough financing environment in Europe, I would say, for 5 or 6 years. And if anything, I would say that environment has been getting better on the private side. So
Mm-hmm.
over and over and over again, and you're seeing this with your conference business, you're seeing European CEOs essentially want to get into the United States where capital market conditions have been better. But my perception is at the moment is that European capital market conditions, if anything, are starting to get a little bit better. In China, capital markets conditions are abysmally bad right now. And unfortunately, some of the underlying factors that are driving that don't seem likely to change anytime soon.
Yeah, from one of the conversations we had at our, biotech showcase, we understand, as I mentioned earlier, that Chinese companies are absolutely looking for doing deals, collaboration agreements, ex-China, because they can't raise money. And what did you say yesterday? There were 9,000 Chinese biotech companies?
I mean, I'll tell you an anecdote. So I was in China in November. I'm going next month to China again. And I'm in this building in Beijing visiting this one biotech company. And I noticed it's like a 6 floor building, and every floor's got like, this biotech and that biotech, you know, 20, kind of like almost like a biotech hotel, you might say. And I asked the guy, I said, how many biotechs are in this building? He said, well, this building has 60. And I'm like, well, like, how many of them are in Beijing? He said, well, we're near the university. He said that we probably have about 3,000. So I said, what you're telling me is that there's like another 20 buildings like this. He said, no, I'm saying there's another 50. And I said, well, what about the country? He said, well, no one really knows, but I think it's about 9,000. He said, Shanghai is definitely bigger than Beijing, and then you've got Suzhou and so on. So the Chinese biotech sector is just humongous. What's interesting is by necessity, they become much more efficient. They don't pay chief medical officers $750,000 in China. They don't pay $200,000 for a patient. They've gotten really good at moving quickly and doing so inexpensively. And that's one of, I think, the most interesting trends that's really been playing out the last couple of years in our sector.
Yeah, what do you, okay. Well, we'll come back to that question for a second. What do you think the opportunities are for young companies that are struggling to get the attention of specialist funds? How do they do it?
So, I mean, it's a, an age-old question. How do you raise money as a biotech? And I like to say, and I know this may not be encouraging to all of the companies that are present on this event, but you want to start off with the right business plan in the first place. If you find yourself in the valley of death where you just can't raise money, you might have written the wrong business plan. So the most important thing any biotech company can do is think very long and hard about the business that you go into. So many entrepreneurs, when you talk to them, well, like, how did you end up pursuing this, particular inhibitor type or receptor kinase inhibitor in your company? And well, I met this guy, he worked on it as PhD. I thought it was really interesting. We started to do some drug development, and then we went out to raise money. So to me, the most important thing is to understand what the venture capitalist is looking for. The venture capitalist is looking for 3 or 4 things. First and foremost is an actionable idea. In other words, does this company actually have a drug that, if appropriately funded, would be able to reach an inflection point that could contribute something that would be useful to patients and to my investors to generate a financial return? So
And how does a company demonstrate that?
like, do you have the chemical matter? Do you have the drug manufactured? Do you have an
Mhm.
appropriate patent estate
Okay,
around that drug? Do you have the people
okay.
that can run the appropriate clinical study or animal studies? So I guess what I'm saying, and as a banker, I'm on the receiving end of probably, gosh, yesterday was like 8 or 9 pitches, like 5 to 10 pitches a day. Overwhelmingly, companies are not fully prepared. Like a typical call might start like, oh, Mr. Jones, it's so nice to meet you. Thank you for the time today. Can you tell me why you reached out to Steeple? Well, we need to be sold. Our board has asked us to be sold. That's usually not a good start to a conversation. That means they can't raise money. And I'll often say, so, what's it that led you to this decision? How did you get here? And then I'll typically say, well, like, let's just show me what you've got. Like, let's get into the project. And usually, like, the company is still trying to get a lead. Like, they have an idea, they found a target, but they don't have a lead molecule. Or they have a lead molecule and they haven't gotten through, animal tox and so on. So the most important thing is, if you're going to take on the project, the assignment, you need to know that you can fund it before you're in. If you discover that you can't fund yourself and you're halfway through the project, that's not a good place to be. I don't mean to be negative. I'm just saying that this is an industry where you need to think very deliberately about your actions before you go into them. And I meet so many companies where, candidly, the actors involved are naive. They don't have the requisite experience. They don't have board members who've been around this industry. They don't have people around that really understand what it's going to take to be successful.
Right, yeah, Tim, we talked yesterday about, the best pitches you've seen and what do they consist of, and the worst pitches. I think we've just touched base on some of the worst pitch approaches.
The
What do you
worst
think?
pitch, the worst pitch is there's no contextualization. You're meeting this banker or capital provider. You don't contextualize. You say, let me just show you some slides. And I'm like, oh, great. I love to see slides. And then, the first slide is, okay, here's the target. We're going after XYZ, receptor, and here's the drug. And the next slide is, this is the IC50 values. Then it's like a bunch of animal data, and there's no effort to say what it means or to contextualize what it means. So I get that pitch a lot. It's not uncommon you'll ask a question and get a
Where
fit.
you're expected to understand and draw the conclusion.
Well, right. And like, it just like, you need someone that can explain why this is relevant, why it's interesting. And then the best
Mhm.
pitch, and I heard a really good pitch yesterday. This woman had worked previously at Google. Not that that makes you great or whatever. And she'd worked at a series of more like tech companies, and she was pitching me on a company that was not so well related necessarily to our history. And I was like, this is going to be interesting. And she was walking through a conference. She had like her conference badge on, and the call happened when it happened. And she just paused, looked straight at me, and in 5 minutes explained exactly what they were doing, where they were, and what they needed to accomplish, why she had reached out to me, and how I could be helpful to her. And it was so succinct that I just immediately reacted, said, "Oh, that's very interesting. I could see you going in one, two, or three directions." And she said, "Great point." And she said, "The direction we want to go into is number two." And I said, "Well, that's interesting. I know a couple of people on your board. I would think that they would look at it this way." And she said, "Look, we've got great support on our board. We have some excellent investors, but what we're missing is someone who can lead the next financing with that board member." And I said, "Well, given what you've just told me, I would think that one of these two investors would be a perfect fit for you." And she said, "Exactly." She said, "I'm
She
glad
knew
that you've
what she
seen."
knew. She knew who they were.
She knew who
She's
they
done her
were. She
homework.
knew what she wanted. She'd done a lot of homework.
Hmm.
And she called me because she wanted to talk to a banker. And I said, "I'm happy to introduce you to either of those two investors tomorrow morning. You just let me know anytime." And it's because I was just so impressed that the company had a good leader who was able to communicate and knew what they knew.
I think that's such an excellent point that you made. I mean, we see this oftentimes in the applications to present at Biotech Showcase or at our other meetings, where, some applications really stand out because all the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted, and they tell you the story. They don't leave you to guess the story, if you know what I mean.
No, completely. And look, this particular person didn't come from Genentech or Pfizer or some place like
Mhm.
that. She had been in a tech company, but she definitely learned how to communicate and how to have a meeting. And I would say if there's one piece of advice I would give is, you know, practice communication, like, and ask people like, how did I do? I mean, I love it when companies say at the end, like, what advice would you give us? Um, and I'm always happy to say, I personally thought that like the deck was better than what you said, or what you said was great and the deck was crap. And so like you need everything to sync up, right? The deck, the data
Right.
room, the
Mhm.
story all has to sync up and follow a narrative.
Yeah, the other advice that I think you touched on also is to research and know what your target investors are investing in.
For
Find a way
sure.
to get introduced to them. Don't go in cold. Do your homework beforehand.
Yeah. And like, what did that investor get their PhD in? Or what is
Mhm.
her or his area of expertise? One thing that a lot of folks probably could do better is research if the venture company has raised money recently. So, does this venture fund have a press release out announcing a new fund in the last 3 years? You can also go to the SEC website, type in the name of the fund on the Edgar system and see if they have a recent Form D. You have to
Great
file a Form D when
advice.
you raise a fund. At least half of the VCs running around out there, like probably more like 80%, don't have money to invest.
Mhm.
And they will never tell you that they don't have money to invest. They just say, "Oh, yeah, this one's not interesting to us." Well, of course it's not interesting. They have no money. And so, like, figuring out, is this person actually qualified to invest in my company is a very important first step. I cannot tell you how
Yep.
many meetings we meet some company of like, let's sign a confidential disclosure agreement so we keep all your data confidential. How's the fundraising going? Oh, it's terrible. We've talked to 110 VCs. Not one of them's interested in our story. Of course, I'm like, okay, well, let's look at the list of the 110 investors. And like, okay, 65 of these have no money. Of the remaining ones, like you're early stage and 80% of them are late stage. So people have to do more research as opposed to just kind of scattershot contacting of
Right. Yeah,
VCs.
we often hear that, as companies come to present a biotech showcase, and they send out blind invitations to investors and don't necessarily get responses. And our advice is always, always to do the research on the investors, reach out to them beforehand. This is just a starting point, if you will. If you don't do your research, they will know immediately that you haven't done the research and the work to find out who they are. So,
Another thing that folks could do more of, I think, is probably to write emails that are specific to the investor. Hey, Sarah,
yes.
it's Tim Opler. I'm working on such and such biotech company. And, based on what you've done before, I think you might be interested in our project in such and such an area. Do you have 5 minutes for a call? So you're much more likely to respond to that as instead of like, I get these things like on LinkedIn from people I've never met,
Mhm.
3 paragraphs of like what they're doing, followed by an attachment. Like I'm not going to respond to that, right? So
Right,
like
without
it's
any
much,
linkage to you or
it's
your knowledge base or who you might
right. The
have a
purpose of every
relationship.
fundraising meeting is to get to the
Mhm.
next meeting till you get the money. And
Right.
so like that you don't need to win in the first meeting. You just need to get to the next meeting.
So Tim, before we go on to some of the questions here, let me ask you uh, what you think is going to happen with regard to pharma deal making with smaller and private companies going forward. Do you
Yeah.
think, I mean, are they only in for later stage assets? Probably not. They need to fill pipelines, so looking for earlier stage assets. What do you think?
So pharmaceutical deal making is typically influenced by 3 things. First of all, do we have money to spend? A lot of them do, but not
Mhm.
all of them.
Mhm.
Second is when are we going to be experiencing impacts on our growth from commercial changes or changes in patent losses? So we have a big patent loss coming up in 2029, say, so we need to get a drug approved by then. The third
Mhm.
thing that's going on is a lot of times the R&D cupboard might be bare in some area. And so pharma deal making can be early stage, it can be late stage. Late stage is typically going to be driven by we have lots of money and we have some patent expirations coming up. So we got to focus on that. Early stage will often be, our scientists are really interested in B cell biology. We've got a great antibody program, but we just missed out on T cell engagers. And so as opposed to making it ourselves and losing 18 months, why don't we go license your T cell engager? And so I personally see a pretty steady pace of early stage deal making. And if anything, I think it's going up. And that's because innovation's going up.
Yeah, yeah, at Biotech Showcase, we had a panel of, BD people from pharma companies. And, initially they were focused really on later stage assets and how everybody was chasing them. And then someone in our audience asked, but, for the most part, we're all early stage. And immediately the tone changed to exactly what you said, patent expiration. We need to fill our pipeline. Yes, we're always looking for earlier stage assets that we can help improve through our partnership to take it to the next level. So I thought that was a really, really positive note.
I'll make a comment. Steeple, the firm I work for, is the world's most active advisor on pharmaceutical industry partnering
Hmm.
transactions. So we work on more partnering transactions than any other financial advisor. That's probably more because we've made a focus out of it, and most of the banks are purely focused on just doing M&A type deals. And what I would say is, we talk to so many companies, and the hardest part is convincing, that one person who really cares inside Merck or Novartis or wherever it is, that they should pay attention to this project. And what I would say is that the the quality of the projects that we're seeing come through is actually up a lot. Um, the scientific breakthroughs that are in development, even it feels like AI that's traditionally been like not that hot, or fibrosis that's been traditionally very difficult. The quality of the projects is really good right now. And so we are seeing a lot of pharma engagement across a wide range of areas at present.
Okay, Tim, I'm looking over at the questions. Do you see them by any chance
No.
that we have in here? Okay, it's 11:50. Let me see if I can get through. Some of them are rather lengthy. Um, one question coming in from somebody who I believe you know is a question about RFK and the fact that he now wants to reevaluate childhood vaccines after saying he wouldn't during his confirmation hearings. Does that dampen your optimism, or are you optimistic about him and his new role?
I mean, RFK is a scary guy from a vaccine perspective, given what he has said. And if you read
Yeah.
what the man has said, it's not good. I would hope that the policy constraints that he faces are such that he will not make significant progress on childhood vaccines. I think it's important to note that the Trump administration running up to the election was very effective at leveraging the media to sort of marshal public opinion for what it wanted to do. And I think it's also important to note that there are other forces in the media. In other words, the editor of any media source gets to choose what stories you see. There's lots of stories you can show in any given day. And I should mention, you can discover my politics. You can just type my name in on opensecrets.org, and you'll note that I'm not a Republican. But I will say that the number of scare stories about RFK Jr. that have been appearing in sort of traditionally liberal media sources has been off the charts, just as one should be very careful about media stories that you read about, how great Trump's going to be, say in Fox News. One should also note that there's never a pro-Trump story on the front of CNN or the New York Times. And
Hmm.
so again, one should be very careful to distinguish between what people want you to believe is going on and what's actually going on. I would be
Yeah,
very, very surprised if our RFK Jr. is going to be going after, the pertussis vaccine anytime soon. And that's just because there's so many powerful policy hurdles that he would have to jump over to be successful in doing that.
yeah, thank you for that, Tim. And I think the warning about the oversaturation of certain commentary in the media is pretty right on.
Right. I
So,
mean, pay attention to the facts. And if RFK starts to hold hearings and efforts to remove childhood vaccines from the market, then that would be scary. And he's certainly not the kind of guy that I would necessarily want, personally, running vaccine policies in the United States. On the one hand, on the other hand, I think there are checks and balances to try to limit the impact of any of those individuals. We should be very careful in our industry to stay focused on innovation and not let hand wringing sort of get in the way of what we all need to do every day in our jobs.
great advice. So I find that I'm overwhelmed. It's like, oversaturation, and suddenly everything just kind of goes dull, if you will.
Right.
So,
And that's true on both sides of the political spectrum.
right. Hmm.
One
Um,
thing, I'll say, if you have the time, any of us can go to Amazon or some other source and buy the new FDA commissioner's books. He's published 3 books. If you read those books, he's a very interesting guy, a very thoughtful guy. He has a very distinct point of view. It's not necessarily my point of view.
I'm sorry, who did you mention?
The new FDA commissioner, Marty McCary, read those books. They're interesting.
Hmm.
Unlike RFK Jr., who's essentially been, developing his policy on the Joe Rogan show, right? So he's essentially playing to the populist crowd. McCarry's a professor from Hopkins who's really developed some actual body of thought that I think is provocative and interesting.
It's a good recommendation. You know, in all the news, I didn't even realize that we had a new FDA commissioner, believe it or not. And
Right,
I'm kind of
right.
focused on this space. So,
Yeah, yeah.
um, some more questions here, Tim. One question came in, are strategic investors better positioned in this context, pharma willing to look at earlier stage programs?
Yeah, I mean, the most we all talk our own book, right? I talked about, Steeple's really good at this, or we started this, you talked about what Demy-Colton can do, and we should talk about our own books. That's a good thing to do. So when biotech companies call me, they talk their own book too. The single most common request I hear is, can you find a pharmaceutical company not to license my program, not to buy my company, but to invest in my company? That's pure fantasy, right? In general, it's not to say that Pfizer doesn't have a venture arm. They do, but in general, they're not venture capitalists, right? So the pharma industry is not one that one should think of as a strategic investor in large part. They're a strategic acquirer or partner for pharmaceutical projects. In the
Okay.
same sense that if you went to a VC, you wouldn't expect them to become your partner in launching a pharmaceutical drug.
Thank you, Tim. So another question that came in is, do biotech startups underestimate market challenges and the need to clearly demonstrate a candidate's potential problem-solving capabilities? I think you spoke about this already.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's a really tough industry, and some people say that every biotech CEO has to be slightly insane to want to go into this business. And again, I kind of involuntarily got a taste of that myself. I would say that there are plenty of people running biotech companies that are coldly rational, very thoughtful, very deliberate in their actions. And so it's important to really think through very carefully all of the things that can go right and all the things that can go wrong, and to be prepared for those.
Have your plan, the backup plans and the backup
Absolutely,
plans for the backup
absolutely.
plans.
A
Yeah,
very
here's
co
the
a very common thing we see are companies that, you go in one direction and it doesn't work out. And so it's very important to be willing and able to pivot and go into another direction. And one of the most fascinating things about the history of our industry is, if you go through, like, what happened, how did, Vertex get here? Or how did Genentech or Alexion? Every one of those companies pivoted multiple times.
Mhm.
And so the ability to assess in real time where you are and rationally say, you know what, this ADC trial is accruing very slowly. And by the way, there are 3 competitive programs. I have $40 million left in the bank. I think I should allocate that money in a different direction. That's a very hard decision to make, but it's one that people should probably make more often.
Right. Yeah, we've seen that decision making, that ability to pivot in some of those really successful companies. I remember Vertex way back when.
Yeah, I
So,
mean, their plan has changed so many times. Yeah.
mhm. So one of our other attendees said Tim was talking about what VCs look for, that VCs look for 3 things in a biotech company. Number 1 is an actionable idea. And he said the conversation then went to a different topic, probably me interrupting you. Can Tim finish those other 2 thoughts?
Yeah. So VCs, they're looking for 3 things: a good idea, a
Mm-hmm.
good management team, and something to take action on. And what I mean by that is an actual molecule that exists, that is differentiated in some meaningful way, that has appropriate patent protection, et cetera. And, the VC is going to say, okay, let's look at the structure of your molecule. And all of a sudden, there's all these people like, hey, I don't like that chloral group over there. And it seems like at one level so unnecessary. And I would say at another level so necessary, right? The VC's job is to assess the thoroughness of your work.
Thank you, Tim. Um, Another attendee did a search on Google, and he said Google told him that MD Anderson received 191 million in an NIH funding in 2023, and that their overhead rate was 62%. I think that means they received 118 million in overhead from the NIH. If the rates go down to 15%, this would mean 29 million in overhead for a delta of around 90 million. Wouldn't layoffs ultimately be needed?
I'm going to dodge that question because I'm not qualified to answer it.
I thought you could do the math really quickly there.
I mean, just to start, I mean, one of the things is 61% doesn't mean 61% of the grant goes to MD Anderson. It may very well mean that 61% of the grant amount is grossed up on top of it. There was a news story saying that. So there's a lot of confusion. And look, the HHS and
Right, it was
NIH
a
are
Google
not,
search. It was a
yeah,
Google search.
yeah, right. So uh, and the average overhead rate is not 61%, right? So maybe that MD Anderson has a high one. For what it's worth, I'm very sympathetic with the Trump administration's view that, we should think hard about overhead rates. It's not that institutions don't need to be funded, but you see some institutions are so busy hiring grant receiving academics so that they can get to their funding. I mean, maybe we need a different mechanism to fund MD Anderson.
Yeah, I recently heard that, on clinical trials, some institutions are getting 150,000 to 200,000 per patient that they enroll,
If
which
not
just
more,
makes the cost, pardon?
if not more. Yeah.
Which makes the cost of doing your clinical trials just extraordinary, especially if you do them here in the States. I don't know what the cost is doing them in other countries. I'm sure it's probably less money than
Look, I
that.
think one of the features of today's era is that we do have giant, excellent medical institutions like MD Anderson across the world. It's not just the US anymore.
Mhm.
And I do think that one of the main drivers of our industry that isn't discussed enough is the efficiency of those institutions and the pay rates and how those institutions are organized. I spent some time yesterday with someone who had just left one of the top cancer institutions in the United States, and he described kind of the need of that organization to go through a reorganization.
Thank you, Tim. Um, One of the other issues that you and I spoke about were the clinical or therapeutic areas that you think are hot versus those that may not be so hot this year. What are the top three hot areas?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you went into the market and talked to people, I think first and foremost, you would hear interest in the field of obesity therapeutics. So we're seeing a lot of breakthroughs in obesity, and there's a lot more coming. It's super excited. It is getting crowded, but I think there's still plenty of room for differentiation there. The second area is the field of autoimmunity, just tons of interest in autoimmunity. And my own feeling is autoimmunity is far from its peak, that this is not, some type of hype cycle. The
Mhm.
scientific breakthroughs that are making it easier to develop appropriate drugs for autoimmune disease just continue. The third area that's very hot, but I think much more difficult is neuroscience. So there is a lot going on. So
Yeah.
for example, the cell therapies that we're seeing for Parkinsonism are really interesting in
Mhm.
neuroscience. And so there is tremendous interest in incremental investment in the neuroscience area. One thing you'll
And
notice is
areas
I
that you,
I didn't mention oncology. So oncology, of course, is still very popular. It is the single most important area for, biosciences investments. But I do think that we're working our way through kind of a lot of the difference between the opportunities and what the market wants in oncology at the moment.
okay, thank you, thank you. Tim, this will be our last question. And it's from an anonymous attendee. Can you recommend any sources to help academic innovators think about the nuances and details of a data package that can help them raise money? That's a pretty
A,
big
da-
question.
a data package. Yeah, I mean,
To help them raise money.
there are some nice books out there. Peter Kolchinsky has a nice book on sort of how to start a biotech company. That's probably a good place to start. Um,
Excellent
but
resources. He has excellent resources.
yeah, yeah, no, and he has a website, rapport.org, I want to say it is,
Mhm.
rapport.bio, maybe it is. Um, The comment I would make is you need to have the science, right? So the science has to be there, and you need to have a strategy for translating that science, that biology, to some type of therapeutic. And it's often the case that those pieces aren't all there. And in the same sense that, you don't want to be figuring out your funding strategy while you're in the middle of a phase 2 trial. You don't want to be approaching VCs till you've really kind of thought through, how does my biological insights really translate to a therapeutic strategy that's going to actually work for patients?
Yeah, I'm also thinking, Tim, to add on to that, how does an academic innovator gain their knowledge of what the space is like? How do they understand who the VC players are? How do they understand, or where do they get that knowledge? I mean, RA report goes so far. I mean, it really is an excellent source of information, but where do they go?
I'll tell you what I do. If I have a
Mhm.
question, I go right to ChatGPT, type in the question. I also like DeepSeek. I've been using that lately. It's awesome. And then I'll say, DeepSeek, tell me the resources that you use to formulate this answer. It'll come back, say, Tim, I looked at this, this, and this, and then I go read them. Like in the old days, you would Google around. Now you just use AI. AI will answer pretty much any question you have.
There you have it, AI to help you write your deck.
You don't really need to listen to this 1 hour long talk. You could just ask your question to AI.
I mean, if it points you in the right direction and helps unblind what you don't know, because I think oftentimes, younger CEOs, younger innovators coming up don't understand the business side. They understand the science side, but not necessarily the business side of what they need to do.
Look, networking is key. Events like Biotech
Yep.
Showcase are great examples. You want to meet people in the industry that know what you don't know. If I know business, let's find some science people. If I know science, let's find some business people. Also, there's clinical people and regulatory people and manufacturing people. So, part of being successful in this industry is building up a network of friends who can help you navigate your way through.
Okay. So Tim, on that note, I think we can wrap this up. Thank you very much for spending your time with us this morning and sharing your knowledge with everyone. Um, that's all the time that we have today. I'd like to thank all of our viewers, and we'd like to thank everybody who submitted questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. Some of them were a bit lengthy to get involved with. And I hope you join us again on future virtual salons that will be scheduled for Demy-Colton. You can find that schedule on our website. So with that said, I'd like to thank Patrick's off. So I'd like to thank Biotech Gate for joining us and doing this. And Tim, of course, your insight is always really, really helpful.
No, my pleasure. And thank you all for spending the time with us this day and look forward to further conversations.